Hi, and welcome to Fairperspectives, the official podcast of the pro-human movement. I'm your host, Melissa Chen, and my co-host, who you will hear from shortly, is Angel Eduardo. Today, we speak with Nick Gillespie. Nick is an editor-at-large at Reason, the Libertarian magazine of free minds and free markets, and host of the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. He serves on the board for Ideas Beyond Borders and is the co-author with Matt Welch of the Declaration of Independence, How Libertarian Politics Can Fix What's Wrong with America. We discuss what libertarianism is and is not, the relationship to anarchism, the role of the state in an ideal society, the lack of a unifying social or political narrative, libertarianism's successes in the West, the rise of China as a world power, social media, and the tensions between libertarian views on private companies versus free expression, Francis Fukuyama, and our crisis of identity, and more. Nick emailed us shortly after the recording to make one correction. At one point, Nick refers to there being currently 100,000 school districts in the United States, a reduction from previous numbers, but there are actually currently 13,500 school districts, also a reduction from previous numbers of 100,000 in 1940. And now, I bring you Nick Gillespie. Nick Gillespie, welcome to Fairperspectives.
I want to call you out on mispronouncing my name.
What? There's no way.
I feel, yes, it's Gillespie.
The hard G. Okay.
Yes.
Nick Gillespie.
And thank you. I feel seen now.
Well, for the two of you who don't know, if you actually look up the dictionary and you try to look up what libertarianism is, you will in fact see Nick's face on it. Nick is the symbol and figurehead of libertarianism in the same way that the Queen of England was the figurehead of the British Empire.
So you're saying that I'm dead. I thank you very much for that.
And yes, that's why we're all actually wearing black. It's got nothing to do with Nick. We're just in national mourning. And as a libertarian part Irish American, I'm sure you have interesting thoughts about the British monarchy.
I talked about this on Reason's podcast. All of my stuff is up at reason.com, but I prefer the Sex Pistols circa 1977's take on the Queen, that she ain't no human being, to the one that Johnny Rotten actually put up on Twitter shortly after he died, which was essentially rest in peace. I don't pay the Queen any mind. My Irish grandparents left Ireland in the 19-teens and really never looked back. And, she seemed like a nice person, but I thank God that I don't live in a world of monarchy.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I would also add, I think if I am indeed the face or figurehead of libertarianism or the libertarian movement, that might explain why we're doing so fantastically well.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's almost inherent in libertarianism to say, well, how dare he? We would never have a figurehead or a face, right? It's all very much about not that sort of thing. But there's so much, in my view, in my trying to understand libertarianism, there's so much noise. There's so much wackiness, and we don't need to get into the specific craziness with the political party itself. But I keep thinking back to that moment where Gary Johnson was being booed for saying that he thinks driver's licenses are a good idea, right? And
that's the ultimate repression. Do we need permission or not from the state, right? I mean, that's
right. So it just there's a lot of just weirdness. So let's just clear the air, at least from your perspective. What is libertarianism and what is libertarianism? Or what is not libertarianism?
Yeah, well, I don't think I can make a definitive definition, and I suspect that we're going to talk about postmodernism in a bit, which actually fits into the way that I talk about libertarianism, which is that I don't want to make grand overarching statements because I don't think that's how human society works. I don't think it's how human knowledge works. It's always partial and incremental. I'll give you my best take, which is, libertarianism is a philosophy that comes out of the liberal movement and the liberal elements of the Enlightenment, and it focuses on giving individuals as much autonomy and choice to create the world that they want to live in. So it is the shift in world history, really, from kind of total institutions, whether we're talking about religions or states and nations and things like that, to one which is more focused on the individual as the constituent, kind of element of everything. And it ultimately is about choosing. It's about choosing how to live. It's about choosing where to live. It's choosing about what to believe. And in its economic application, that tends towards free markets, or what's called free markets or capitalism. In politics, it's limited government, because individuals have certain rights that the majority cannot vote to take away from everybody. But, and this is where I disagree with some of my libertarian friends, I'm not an anarchist, and I don't think I'm not taking all of these ideas to their logical conclusions, where there is no state, there is no, under no circumstances would there ever be, would you ever allow such an oppressive regime as a driver's license system? I'm not there
right.
yet. Give me, the fourth or fifth administration of the Ron DeSantis presidency, and maybe I'll be there. I don't know, but right now, not so much. But it's essentially it's liberalism. It's tolerance. It's pluralism. It's a belief in progress with a small p. And it is ultimately about individuals being set free to create the communities that they are most interested in opting into. A shorthand way that a guy named Leonard Read, who founded way back, I guess in the 30s, one of the oldest organizations that could be considered libertarian, Foundation for Economic Education, he called it anything that's peaceful. That's also another way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a notable libertarian. It's been a while since I've listened to him, though, so I don't know if it's shifted. But Penn Jillette always talked about basically the scenario you should envision is, what would you be willing to hold people at gunpoint for? And
right.
that's kind of what the limits of libertarianism is. So it's or the limits of government would be, right?
Yeah.
There's a monopoly on force, and then there's a monopoly on maybe a couple of other things. But besides that, if you can imagine someone holding you at gunpoint for it and having that be egregious and ridiculous, then it's out of the bounds of libertarianism. Does that still make sense? Or
I think so a bit. I recently did a very long and interesting and fun interview with Penn, and who during COVID kind of was, he both took himself out of the libertarian movement and was cast out by various people. And we talked a lot about that. But that's that's a fairly good idea. In politics, libertarianism is limited government. In economics, it is, if not full laissez-faire capitalism. It errs on the default setting is to allow people to do things rather than not. It's bottom up as opposed to top down. And I think in social, kind of in social and cultural contexts, it's very much about laissez-faire. That people have a broad right to live how they want to live, to eat how they want to eat, to speak how they want to speak, to create the art and the buildings and the structure. And again, I keep coming back to this idea of communities. That you get to run as many experiments in living, as John Stuart Mill might say, as possible. Years and years ago now, I think this would have been in the late 90s, I talked about kind of a libertarian sense of government as a kind of operating system. If we think about an operating system like Windows or iOS or something like that, but where it's the operating system that allows an infinite number, or something approaching infinity, a number of individual applications to run without crashing the system. So it's very basic rules of kind of respect, dignity, property rights, but then there is a role also for certain types of limitations on that. If you are acting in a particular way, is going to completely crash the system. And we'll always be arguing about where that line is being drawn, just as 18th and 19th and 20th century liberals did. So, and that's where it gets confusing and kind of interesting, I think.
Well, Nick, you mentioned it's bottom up as opposed to top down. And what I find interesting about the time that we're living in right now is that you have a sort of interesting kind of censorship that's coming from bottom up. And you have the China system where it's very top down. The government censors a lot of stuff. They control what you can say and what you cannot. And in the United States, we don't have those kind of institutional control from the government in terms of speech, at least. But we have a sort of bottom up censorship, and it's interesting how that ends up converging closer than one might normally expect in theory.
Or that it's more repressive, it's more effective. I mean, this is one of, the joke I used to make. I've been at Reason Magazine, which was started in 1968 and is kind of like, if libertarianism has a monthly magazine and a website, it's Reason. And by the way, there are like, millions of people who will absolutely disagree with that. So, fuck them. But part of the idea, behind libertarianism was, the government isn't really good at what it does. It's kind of incompetent at best and malevolent at worst. But that, and even John Stuart Mill talks about this too, of that, it's churches and society and non-governmental institutions or organizations that are much more successful at repressing and oppressing people. Maybe not in oppressing people, but so Melissa, to your point, when we talk about things like speech codes and when we talk about, wokeness or, what used to be called political correctness getting into people's heads in the United States, at least until now, it's not fun. It's not mostly the government doing this kind of stuff, but it can be very effective because you don't want to be cast, it's one thing to be cast out of, the state assembly in upstate New York or something like that. It's another thing to be cast out of your family or your tribe or your religion or the only real community you've ever known. So this goes to both a strength and a limitation, I think, of libertarianism as it's been kind of articulated over the past 50 years or so, is that it often has a focus almost exclusively on state power, which makes sense. But in the current moment, it kind of misses that larger threat, which can come from, and it can be, like the vegan co-op, wherever Blake Masters went to college, kind of trying to shut down discourse or something like that. But it can also be a corporation. It can be, within a company shutting down things. Google, which is a very liberal corporation, obviously both, said that it wanted wide-ranging debate on all kinds of things internally because they understand that's how you get better products and more interesting things going. But, obviously they didn't want that. And, and then many corporations have, very strict speech codes, which is also not always bad. But, to that larger point, power is not simply, coming from politics or the government or even the men with guns. It can be, it can be coming from all sorts of ways. I don't know if any of you were raised Catholic, but I was, and the Catholic Church, which in a way did have access to guns and things like that. But, its primary, and this is, I guess, true of most religions, the primary way that it replicates itself is not through force explicitly. It's, it's through mental kind of contortions and kind of, wrestling people into points of view so that they censor themselves before they even have certain kinds of thoughts.
I was raised Catholic too, and it's a psychological warfare. It's a very,
and again, it's not bad. For me, this is the fundamental issue for a kind of libertarian worldview. And I don't like to use libertarian as a noun or invoke libertarianism. I like using libertarian as an adjective, or, it's kind of directional. It's a preset. It's not the be all and end all. But it isn't bad to have organizations like that. The real question is whether or not people are free to leave. Are people free to criticize, and are people free to leave? Albert Hirschman, a political economist, wrote a book in the early 70s called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And it was about how do people deal with systems in decline, whether it's a corporation or a state or a society? And he said, there's basically three strategies. There's loyalty, which is you become a company man or a super patriot and you just put up with whatever's going on. You use voice, which is that you use whatever notions of remedy or possibilities to talk about stuff and to reform things from within. Or you access exit and just leave and start your own thing. And, that's, to me, like if we're living in a society where you have exit, voice, and loyalty, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's what I meant about the psychological warfare. I don't mean to paint the whole spiel that way, even though my experience was mainly that. But there is this thing of, you can't really leave. If you leave, there are severe consequences, relationship-wise, psychologically, existentially, probably, right? There are all these things that maybe it's kind of like an invisible fence, right? They don't necessarily show you or tell you that it's there, but you feel it. As you get towards the edges, you start to feel the shocks, and it makes it more difficult to move. Now, So, I know Melissa has a lot of really in-depth, awesome questions for you, and I don't want to monopolize the time.
But let's not do that. Yeah, let's talk about Catholicism instead.
Well, no. But I just have more sort of, I guess, pedestrian questions about libertarianism. And I like your conception of it because I think you seem to understand certain limitations of going all in on any kind of ism. Right? I love your idea of using it as an adjective rather than a noun because then it qualifies things and it informs things, but it is not the be all end all, as you said.
Right.
And one of those problems that I see is, it all sounds great and I'm for it, where, individuals are that is the fundamental unit, the individual human being. And given all the diversity and variety in terms of perspective and desires and all that sort of stuff, that's great. To be able to keep that field as open as possible. And having things work bottom up in terms of choice and how we structure things and how we live our lives. That's great. And then, of course, there are, top-down things that we have to grapple with and deal with. But I feel like there's also something that a lot of people may not take into consideration, which is that there are also outside-in factors, right? Which is that, for example, you're taller than me. That's going to make a difference in a few fundamental ways that I can't do anything about, right? We can argue about which one of us is more handsome, but that also plays a part, right? And there's not a lot we can do about that either, unless we have tons of money for plastic surgery where I can become a clone of you. So there are things like that, talent, skills, all these things that play a part in what choices we're able to make or what choices even occur to us to make, right? And that becomes, for me, the place where there's a window toward some sort of top-down thing to help even things out, so that's.
Can I suggest, like, maybe it's not top down, but this is where, I said earlier that I'm not an anarchist. I believe in limited government, and I think there's a legitimate role for the state, and one of them is exactly in the sort of circumstances that you're talking about. And I'm not saying the state should give everybody a voucher for $20,000 of plastic surgery so they can become whoever they want.
Let's all look like Nick Gillespie.
But God, that would be a terrifying world. More for me than anyone else, I think, because I see myself in the mirror, right? Like this, when you talk about that, one of the questions, and this is something that came up a lot in 19th and early 20th century discussions of liberalism and to a certain degree libertarianism, but if people are given choice or they're responsible for their choices, but they don't really have a way to participate in society, that is grotesque, right? I mean, because you're kind of holding them accountable for things that they can't really do anything about. And that's one of the reasons, that's the argument for public funding of education, not for the school system we have now, but for the state to say, we are going to help people who, for whatever reason, are not able to, their parents, you're a kid, and your parents are not able to like help you participate fully by getting a decent education, at least a rudimentary one, or you don't have access to food, so you can't grow, to whatever you would be assuming, good nutrition. So we're going to help with that kind of stuff. Right. So I think, I'm with you on that. And then we can agree on that goal. And then there are different ways to implement it. So for instance, like what we've developed in the United States is, a system of public education, which is not it's not centered on the individual and giving the individual kid or their parents acting as their guardians choice. It is, it's created these large buildings that look very much like minimum security prisons. And that's what we're funding, as opposed to saying, okay, here's money, we might put some guardrails on what you can do with it, but basically go and find amid, all of the offerings here, an education that you think will be good for your kid. And, and you want to maintain, one of the things about libertarians, and I think there's some truth to this, that as a social movement, it is, predominantly white and upper middle class and male. I think all of these things are changing and they're not fully accurate. But it believes in true diversity, because one of its starting points is that all of us have different wants and also different talents and different things we want to be doing. And the last thing you want to do, I mean, when you look at, again, just to focus on education, because I mean, you guys obviously deal with a lot of that. Education is, has functioned as a great homogenizer in American society in the worst ways possible. And I think that's coming out more and more now, where my parents, who were the children of immigrants who grew up in Waterbury, Connecticut, my mother in an Italian ghetto, and my father was born in Hell's Kitchen here in New York and grew up in Manhattan and Brooklyn. The public schools were not designed to allow them to, bloom as individual flowers. It was, they were being taught to become, kind of widgets on an assembly line of what it meant to be an American, what it meant to be a good citizen, what, et cetera. And like, there were some real benefits to that, but it was not about diversity, like allowing diversity to develop and flourish. It was quite the opposite. So, not to, go off too much on education, although I think it's really important because it focuses both on a limitation or a perceived limitation of libertarian ideology. What do you do about kids? Because it's one thing for adults to be responsible for themselves, but also what its goals are, which is really to create a society that is as rich and varied as the individuals in it. And all of those people, regardless of their starting points of where you get kind of thrown into history or thrown into existence, how do you get the best shot possible at participating? And I think, with a little help, and sometimes it comes from private organizations, and it can also come from the state as well. And then, but the important thing is that it's facilitating individual empowerment and flourishing, not just feeding into these giant, kind of buildings and machines and institutions that don't actually serve people. They feed on individuals.
Right.
I will say, Nick, though, that the global perspective on American education is already that it is very decentralized, especially if you compare to other education systems like in France, in the UK, even where I grew up in Singapore. You have very centralized educations. There's national curricula. And, even in France, like the examination system is highly centralized. So the United States is unique. And I think people around the world do actually look to the US as a place where there is, if you kind of plot the normal, the distribution, you will see very, very wide tails, right? So you'll have super geniuses. You'll have, on the other end, also people that just really don't perform very well. But then the whole average, I think it had been my view until I got here that one of the reasons why Americans actually perform very poorly in global tests like the PISA rankings in math proficiency and English proficiency is actually the lack of anything central. Because we don't have a national testing in a way. We use the SATs to kind of see how a GPA from this school in Connecticut compares to one in California. But other than that, it seems to me that America already has a very decentralized system. And it wasn't until it became very clear that there was a force in America slowly indoctrinating students that I realized actually this decentralized system might be the only thing that's kind of holding it back. And coming to that position to say, like, okay, you know what, maybe this wasn't a bad thing. Maybe decentralization wasn't a bad thing.
Yeah. It's also, I mean, one of the things to think about is, what are the choices in front of any, given individual? And you're totally right that in an international comparison, the U.S. is this, anarchistic, chaotic system where we have over 100,000 school districts for K through 12 schools, which is way down from what it had been before World War II, by the way. So there, even with that many, it represents an intense consolidation, from 100 years ago. But then part of the thing though is you go to school where you live, and there aren't that many options in any given school district. And, that's kind of one of the focus, certainly, of the school choice movement, which is very closely allied with libertarianism. Milton Friedman in 1955 came up with the idea of a school voucher, essentially to bring in as a thought experiment, to bring in market forces into K through 12 education. But the payoff in a lot of ways in the American system, you really see in the college and university system, for all of its flaws, we've got about 4,400 four-year colleges and universities in the country. And it's an inefficient system for sure. A lot of it is propped up, with government subsidies, student loans, Pell Grants, and things like that. So the market is bigger than it would be without those. And I don't think those are all bad, by the way, necessarily. But, what's great is that you have a lot of different schools doing a lot of different things, and you have the ability of people to enter school later. I mean, one of the things that Americans, I think, and certainly libertarian Americans look at is the degree of centralization in places like England, France, Germany, and increasingly now places like Japan or China, Singapore, and, kind of like Asian tiger economies. And man, like the idea that if you fuck up, when you're in third grade or in fifth grade, that's it. Like you're not going to university. And it's not quite as draconian, but I went to high school in New Jersey with a Japanese exchange student who, explained that like by coming to the U.S. for this year, like he was absolutely foreclosing a whole host of possibilities in the Japanese education system. And that's kind of fucked up, I mean, and there's, wow. And one of the things that is disturbing actually, though, is also beyond and I'm happy to talk about kind of questions of nationalism and national identity. I think we might get to that in a little bit because there's a strength there, but also, a real problem, I think, when you're in that tightly controlled and regulated a system as you see in many countries. We want to be able to, kind of pick and choose and move at our own pace and also, reconfigure our lives as we change. I mean, and again, to get back to this concept of libertarian, there's a series of Austrian-born economists, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek are the best known, where, they talk about kind of your sense of yourself and what you want out of life, just like as with a consumer, changes over time. And a system that allows more people to kind of change and grow and opt in and out of things as they get older and as they're, what they want changes is fundamentally, that's a better system. That's a moral statement to say it's better to have a society where more people can do more different things, rather than a more regimented one.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So I guess moving on to sort of more politics and kind of the especially on the international arena, it seems like we talk a lot about liberalism now and the trend lines. What do you think is happening? Both domestically, globally, the state of liberalism, the post World War II kind of liberal order. What is causing, there seems to be like a new economic and political realignment. Mm-hmm. What is causing that in your estimation?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say about that is, and domestically, and I think this is broadly true internationally as well, but, we focus a lot on like the end of, and obviously when we're talking about liberalism here, we're talking about it not Ted Kennedy style liberalism, but, a kind of classical liberalism of, tolerism, pluralism, limited government, kind of freer markets, things like that. There's definitely a populist pushback on, what is perceived as the end of a kind of liberal or libertarian dream, or the failure of that to deliver. But, one of the things I like to stress is that the libertarian movement, not the Libertarian Party and not people even who necessarily call themselves libertarian, have over the past 50 years, 70 years, have actually seen a huge amount of wins. When you look at the individual is taken more seriously and in a better way and is given more freedom to live however you want. If you are, if you are Black, if you are gay, if you are female, these things hold you back less than they ever did because society has shifted from a much more rigid kind of class, broadly, not economic class, but, a way of looking at people based on one or two parts of your identity. And that's huge. The country now is, is fundamentally more interested in trade, and they understand, gains from trade. In the United States, despite the rise of Donald Trump, more people are in favor of immigration than ever before. And, in the 20th century, 75% of people, according to Gallup, say that immigration is good for the country. I mean, it's like a historic high. Things like drugs are being legalized, not, partly because people realize that like top-down solutions like prohibition don't work and they poison everything from policing to the law to foreign policy to education. They're just incredible time wasters. So they're inefficient, but also that people have a right to change their minds. We all use all sorts of drugs to modulate our moods, to increase our productivity, to increase our sex lives. People are just much more chill about, about a truly diverse and pluralistic society. You don't have to be religious even to run for office anymore. And I'm not particularly anti-religion. I'm not even anti-Catholic anymore. I worked that out when I was in high school. But it's, we live in a fundamentally more libertarian society than we did certainly at the end of World War II. I do think you're right, Melissa, that both nationally and internationally, the institutions that were created after World War II are no longer working, and that includes things like the UN or the World Health Organization or, the World Trade Organization, NATO. NATO ceased to have a clear function once the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is, the fact that the free world won the Cold War is a huge reason why the post-war consensus collapsed, because the main thing that it was oriented around disappeared. And what we do in the wake of that, and we saw this in the 90s with the rise of kind of global trade and a positive defense of global trade and pulling more and more countries and more people into international trade. There are a lot of things that are related to that. We didn't just trade more goods and services, but people started moving around more freely. The EU developed into, what it kind of is now, although that's receding too, because, the European Union coming out of the common market was very much of a Cold War, a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So it kind of makes sense that it had a lot of momentum and it continued to build up in a certain way after the end of the Soviet Union, but it seems to be kind of collapsing now. And I worry about all of these things, not because those things need to last forever. The United Nations may have served a function. It doesn't really seem to be doing that now. I don't know that NATO doesn't need to stay as NATO, but we need to be working more on what are the institutions, what are the communities, what are the mindsets that will take us into this era now, where in a fundamental way, we are moving past the nation state as the fundamental institution in our lives, which started in, maybe the 18th, certainly the 19th century, and had a run through part of the 20th. We're in a different world now. The world is networked. The world is global in a way that it wasn't. And the other thing that I want to stress in all of this is that a lot of the ennui and the malaise and what seems to be decline in North America and in Western Europe, or what used to be called Western Europe, which is just Europe now, is because other parts of the world are doing so much better. And we are recognizing that the world has multiple sources of power and of meaning and of kind of gravitational force. So I think in a lot of ways, the United States is in a place that is analogous to England and France after World War II, where they were part of the winning side, et cetera. And it's not like their lifestyles or their standards of living were going to decline precipitously, but they were not going to be as powerful or as hegemonic as they had been earlier in the 20th century. And the United States is still massively powerful in all of that, but we're kind of owning up to the fact that we can't control everything. We shouldn't control everything, and that the world is getting on with itself, whether or not we're calling the shots or not. And that creates a lot of dislocation, a lot of fear, and a lot of anxiety, culturally as well as economically and politically.
I wonder if another factor is something you mentioned a moment ago, which is that we're kind of living in this more libertarian world already. So that brings me back to the kooks, the anarchists and the extremes.
I'm not going to say anarchists are necessarily kooks, by the way.
I separated
them. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, but that brings me back to people who maybe their views are more extreme and they're pushing further than where we currently are, where we currently were trying to get. Do you think it at least partially is the result of the fact that we've made so much progress? We've already covered so much ground. Now it's like, well, we got to keep going because this is who I am. This is part of my identity. So now we have to kind of, that seems like a phenomenon. You were mentioning it in the form of institutions where they lost their primary goal because that thing was over now. And now they're kind of just dwindling, or they're kind of just.
I think in the United States, this is a fundamental issue. And people like Wesley Yang, used to talk more about, the struggle to find what he called a successor narrative to, a Cold War, identity in America, which is, and it's also odd because like in America, what did it mean to be American during the Cold War? And kind of fundamentally, it meant to not be the Soviet Union.
Right.
And so we just kind of became a mirror image. So we were individuals because they were a blob of, non-sentient, non-player characters who were all being controlled. We believed in free enterprise. They believed in communism, et cetera.
Right.
They were atheists. So we were religious, and suddenly when your enemy disappears, you're kind of like, oh, I have to create a positive identity for myself. And it's more troubling than we think. The United States also in the 20th century, and I think a lot about this because my grandparents were all immigrants. And I think immigration is, the right of exit, as I talked about a little bit before, but the right to go wherever you want, not necessarily to be given a job and welfare and everything, but like that might be the fundamental human right, like just to kind of move around, freely. Is very much under attack. But for a good chunk of the 20th century, the United States consciously tried to call itself a nation of immigrants, even though, when we were in a meaningful way, even if we were have always been ambivalent towards immigration and whatnot. And we've always been worried that, whatever it is to be a true American will be overwhelmed when you start having these fucking idiots from Central Europe and from Italy and from, now increasingly from, East Asia and South Asia, and Mexico. Oh my God, like how can Mexicans be American even if they're part of North America? Like, but the fact that we are struggling to come up with a coherent, inclusive group identity, I think maybe it doesn't empower, but it allows people who are extreme to kind of argue, no, this is what it means to be American in the 21st century. And I think, broadly speaking, a group like Black Lives Matter has said, okay, we're going to define what it means. What is America about? The American project is that it is, a country that is uniquely racist and hostile to difference, and that its only real function, because it's conceived in evil, in slavery, which is evil. Its main purpose to continue existing is to pay literal and figurative reparations to the people that it's harmed. That's not going to win in the long run because it doesn't include, there's not enough buy-in. People are going to be like, no, I don't get anything out of that, really. I mean, including other minorities, but also then, the white people or the majority culture, however defined, that's paying, for all of that. They're kind of like, why am I doing this after a certain while? But we haven't, and populists, like Trumpian populists, are trying to come up with, a narrative or a kind of imagined American, which is, mostly white, which is mostly male, which is mostly reactionary, which is part of its problem. And that's not going to stick. And so we're seeing, a vying for what is the national identity going to be now that we kind of need to invent one.
We seem to be doing a terrible job of substituting the Soviet Union with all these other ideas.
We tried, with Islamic terrorism was going to be the enemy, but what became clear, and I don't know how to put it without sounding like a complete asshole, but I knew this from the beginning. But as 9/11 was happening, I mean, as the ashes hadn't even fully settled from the Trade Center, collapsing, and people were like, okay, well, the world now is in a struggle between, America and Islamofascism or something. And it's like, Islamic fascism is not an existential threat in the way that communism was, the way that international communism was. And even that was oversold. So that was that was one thing where we are now in a new Cold War. Donald Rumsfeld actually, shortly after 9/11 said we are in a new Cold War. And like the old Cold War, this is going to take a fundamental reordering of society in this, to fight this objective. And it's just, it wasn't a real enemy.
Yeah, but there is a reordering now. I mean, if I agree with you that there has been, in many ways, the liberal gains, especially when pertaining to individual rights, have only improved. But globalization has been on the decline since, the two planes slammed into the World Trade Center in 2008 when Lehman Brothers collapsed. Then when Brexit happened and Donald Trump was elected, and then COVID.
Yeah.
And so you see this reversion almost back to a Cold War mentality, even though the analogy breaks down because we are actually economically now engaging with these other nations.
Right.
I mean, there seems to be a very clear axis developing, right? And it's led now by China. I mean, Russia is showing us, especially with the results of the invasion of Ukraine, that it kind of overestimated its own military capabilities. But I wanted to ask you actually about kind of the rise of China, because that seems to me to be the framing of this new version of a Cold War, even though I don't like that analogy because, like I said, it's not really, it's very different from the USSR.
The Soviet Union didn't own, a significant chunk of America's national debt and whatnot. It's a fundamentally different kind of engagement.
Yes. But, we were told for decades, it was almost an ironclad law that once countries would liberalize economically, right, that they would also, the people would demand political reforms and that would come. But it seems like this is being refuted today. If you look at modern day examples, it's not just China. There are other authoritarian countries that have very, very free markets and really easy to do business there. So what went wrong? Was our assumption wrong, or did something in development go wrong?
Yeah, it's and I think you've referred to it, and other people have, as like Milton's first law of development. Milton Friedman, said that when you get economic liberalization, people get richer. And then richer people start demanding political freedom, because it's kind of like once you have a little bit of spare change, you want to be able to spend it on the things that you want to spend it on. So you push back against authoritarian regimes. And in the 80s, we saw this, after the death of Mao in China. The Chinese economy was liberalized. And, in the spring of 1989, you had the Tiananmen Square, the student revolt, where they erected a statue of liberty, like a facsimile of the Statue of Liberty, and said we wanted freedom. And it all seemed to be going perfectly according to that plan. The tanks rolled in, and now we're looking at a very different China. What I would argue is that I think Friedman is still right, and the timetable is clearly wrong. But what China has been able to do, and in many ways it's almost unique in this, and certainly in terms of a large country, because there are places like Singapore, which on a day-to-day level, particularly for people who live there, and everything I'm saying here I have known and I'm misinterpreting from what you've said, what you've told me, but it's authoritarian and socially repressive, but it is very easy to do business. But it's also not, it is not a big player in the way that China is. It just doesn't have the people. And I think what China has been able to do is that they've been able to buy off political disruption and dissent, because since Mao died, essentially, they've been returning, high annual growth in their economy, which means that, people in China within their lifetime, they can remember, famines in the early 60s and the Cultural Revolution, and whatever they have now is not quite that, because they are now living in cities, of millions of people. They have good jobs, they have a lot of food, et cetera. That is actually slowing down. And I think what we're going to see is China, is a massive country. Physically, it's the size of the continental United States, and then it's got, 3 times as many people. As economic growth declines, China is going to be dealing with a lot of dissent and discontent internally, because the people there are wealthier, and it's kind of being eroded by government policy or by economic disruption. So I think that you will be seeing a lobbying for, more freedom in China. And, and this is, perhaps this is an opinion that, is unburdened with, empirical knowledge of the situation. But what I would argue is that just in the way that my grandparents, they left, what Rumsfeld called old Europe, and they were peasants, for 1,000 years, and they moved to what we would look at now as objectively horrible circumstances. I mean, my father and mother grew up in tenement buildings, and they had they had friends who were killed or deformed by polio and all of this kind of stuff. But it was so much better than what they would have had if they had stayed in Europe, that it took a while, and it actually took their, my grandparents' grandchildren to be the ones who say, like, fuck it, we're going to do what we want to do. My parents were not free. They were economically better off. And I think something analogous in China is going to happen. That as you get a couple of generations of full bellies and of rising expectations, you will push back against that. I don't think the Chinese government and the surveillance state is as overwhelmingly efficient as we are led to believe, because ultimately, in the end, these systems get rotted out from within, because people, and this is not, this was part of the problem with the foreign policy put forth by the Bush administration in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's like once you get rid of despotism, like liberty grows. I'm just saying, China has shown its people what the good life looks like. And the first version of it is that you have enough to eat. Then you start to get better housing and cars and education. And that never ends well for authoritarianism. And I think we'll see over the next 5 or 10 years in China. But we also have to understand that, just on a fundamental objective level, people in China now are so much better off than they were 20 years ago. That is not a small thing to acknowledge, because it helps explain what's going on there. Now, one of the things that is, problematic, though, is like, let's say China's economy continues to decline, relatively speaking and whatnot. what does the government do? Because, when we saw this in Russia, with Putin, Russia is almost a third world country, and it's been broke for a long time. And, when the economy is going terribly in Russia, et cetera, Putin invades another country. And with China, one of the things that China seemed to have learned, which is why it's in such a relatively good position economically, is that its lesson from the Cold War is that you can have a lot more power and a lot more influence by trading with people rather than by invading them. The Soviet Union, ultimately, one of the reasons it failed was because it was an overextended empire that couldn't really produce things. China seems smarter than that.
So Xi Jinping has studied the USSR quite obsessively and actually blamed some of its decline on glasnost and perestroika policies that the USSR enacted. So we're seeing this trend line where China was liberalizing, and then all of a sudden Xi Jinping takes power and he's been grabbing onto the reins and increasingly regulating all aspects of Chinese life, from the economy to various aspects of social life. So there's just a far more heavy-handed approach to regulating all sorts of behavior across the board. So I worry with the retreat of the United States from various parts of the world. We have no appetite now after 9/11, after the failed war on terror. And so when the U.S. retreats, it leaves a huge vacuum for China to fill. And you start to see that with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the Chinese actually exporting this kind of like techno surveillance capabilities to other countries. And so autocrats around the world just seem like a far better model for development than the United States as it stands currently. So when you said it never ends well for autocrats, I am personally not sure, because the experiment in liberal democracies is so short and we're currently living in it right now. And I'm not confident as you are about how this ends, because there seems to be a huge crisis of confidence, even here in the West, about what our values actually are. So I struggle to see how this all ends well, actually.
I agree with you. I take seriously everything that you're saying. And one thing I would say also, though, is that if the experiment in liberal democracy is only 250 years old or something, the experiment in total state surveillance based on a kind of Soviet model is even younger and less proven. So let's keep these things in perspective. And one of the things that's fascinating, my background's in literary studies and cultural studies, and I used to hear a lot about kind of post-colonial studies. And it always struck me as bizarre that Marxism, as practiced in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, it's like the ultimate Western export to the developing world. And it's always somehow like Mao isn't communist China, such a colonial outpost of the Enlightenment, of 19th century Europe, more so, than Kenya or Algeria, for God's sake. I wish people would kind of take that more seriously. But there's a number of things to think about in what you're talking about. And one is that the United States, I do think, is going through a real crisis of confidence, and a kind of rightful one, because, we killed a lot of people. We spent a lot of money and a lot of time chasing phantoms in the war on terror for no good reason. Most of our Cold War efforts were stupid and counterproductive. And we cannot separate in the United States the idea of military intervention from having a positive presence elsewhere in the world. And this is what's worrying me. And it's not that Donald Trump said that, well, Europe should pay for its own defense and we shouldn't have troops everywhere around the world, even if he didn't do much to pull them home. But that he also wanted to pull back economically. He wanted, anytime anybody is talking about becoming more of an autarky, like a self-sustained economic and cultural and political bubble, man, that's just bad. That's the lesson to learn from China centuries ago, when they burned their boats and looked inward and then just kind of regressed for hundreds of years. And the fact is that the United States' lack of confidence is really showing in terms of economics and in terms of culture. Where the thing that people love about American culture, and this is true all over the world, is that it is a vehicle of self-expression and self-exploration and kind of exuberance of what happens when people are kind of free to explore the world and who they are and who they want to become and who they want to marry, and how they want to mongrelize all sorts of things. That's what sells America around the world. And it bothers me that in America, like a lot of the stuff that you guys deal with is this idea that individualism is somehow evil and rotten and needs to be extirpated. And that, that we need to be policing what we think and what we feel and what we say. Because it might harm somebody. It's like, man, you're really that. If that kind of groupthink becomes totally endemic to American society, in education and cultural production and economic production, we're really screwed. Yeah. And that's, to me, this is one of the things that, going back to this question of like, what is an American national narrative, in the 21st century? So it's post-Cold War, it's post-war on terror, it's post-COVID, it's post-economic crisis. If it needs to incorporate a heavy and healthy dose of individualism and of kind of self-actualization, I think what we are seeing in America is not people worried about scarcity as much as it is that we have managed successfully. And I think this is increasingly true of what used to be called the West, which is a bad and imprecise term, but also of the world. More and more people can now afford to think about, what do they want to be when they grow up? And, we have kind of massified existential angst. And this is new in human history. It's new in American history, where like everybody pretty much has a shot at kind of becoming the best version of themselves. Like, that's
yet they all want to be
cliche.
Influencers though, right? Yet they all want to be the same thing. They just want to be TikTok influencers. So
yeah, the circles I travel in, Melissa, and I am significantly older than you. Not a lot of TikToker and influencer dreams, but but this is what we need to be. How do we give people the tools to kind of do that in a thoughtful, intentional, and real way? And those aren't the discussions we're having. And this is, my background is in the humanities, and like, it kills me when I started grad school in 1988 for literature, English or American literature and cultural studies. And, like when you look at the number of people who major in the humanities in college now, it's like it's gone from whatever it was to zero. That's the direction. And it's bad because the humanities are, I think, traditionally one of the ways that you deal with this. Like, how do you, how do you learn from the past without being trapped by the past? And how do you kind of create these spaces, and this is what art and literature and music and creative expression is about, where you create these spaces where people are kind of scenario planning through writing and movies and music and drama and whatnot. And in one way, we're doing that more than ever because there's more stuff out there. And in another way, that's one of the big threats is like, we've got to shut this stuff down because people are making songs and, movies and writing books or having conversations I don't like. So we got to stop.
Speaking of that, I was curious to ask you about this because there's this tension between social media or Twitter specifically as the concept of Twitter as the public square, and then the concept of Twitter as a privately owned platform whose owners can do whatever they wish, right? So, those things are directly in conflict with each other. And every time somebody gets banned from Twitter, we have the same conversation about free speech, free expression, and the culture versus the reality. I'm curious what you think about it from a libertarian perspective.
Yeah, and this is where I fall into a pretty doctrinaire libertarian line, which is that Twitter is a private entity, as are all of the social media companies, and that the last thing I want to see, like, no matter how shitty they are, I don't want to see the government starting to tell them how to operate their business, because this is ultimately a business regulation. And On top of that, though, I think it's really important to look at the reality of things, and that, it's incredibly important to recognize that as this conversation was happening, even Facebook left Facebook and became Meta. And they are showing a decline in the developed world, and Facebook functions more like the internet in many poorer countries. And it also, it's got its issues, but it's giving access to something that people absolutely didn't have. In the US and in Europe, it's fading because, in terms of users. Same thing with Twitter. Twitter has had essentially, a very static user base because people don't like it. And people don't like it for different reasons. Some are like, oh, there's too much unmoderated talk, or there's too much moderation, but it's not working that well. And you're seeing a proliferation, whether it's TikTok, or Discord groups and all sorts of decentralized and new, less governable or more governable, alternatives. What I think is most important is not what any of focusing on big tech. This is the economic history of the United States and antitrust action is that big companies, like dominant firms, become the target of antitrust. That's like the leading indicator that they no longer matter the way they used to. This was true of the railroads. It was true of big corporations like Standard Oil and tobacco companies and things like that. They want the regulation oftentimes because it allows them to fix the market at a place where they're at their peak, and they know that. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg talked in 2018 about how it's time for the internet to be regulated, and we want to help you write those regulations. He was quite blatant about it. And Facebook has been running ads saying, a lot has happened since 1996 when the rules that broadly govern the internet were first staked. And they have people born in 1996 talking about look at how, older and fatter I am now. We need new regulations. That's a clear signal. They want regulatory capture because they're going to be able to be in charge of it. So I don't worry about that too much as long as people have the ability to go elsewhere. And I think broadly speaking that they do. And I think certainly all of us who are in a broad free speech coalition, which, free speech is libertarian, but not all people in the free speech coalition, are doctrinaire libertarians for sure. But we have so many tools at our disposal. And I think, groups like you're doing, as well as the shift of fire from, talking about higher education to, areas that the ACLU has kind of announced a pullback on. These are all really good signs that there is a robust free speech, free expression, free thought, not only community, but the ability to get this stuff out there. And that's the ball that you got to keep your eye on. And also then all of these social institutions and mindsets that come along with that, which is, things like tolerance and pluralism. Because when we talk about things like wokeism, or, when I was in grad school, it was political correctness. It was the term for effectively the same phenomenon. We need to push back on that, because if you don't, they're bullies in a profound way. And there are also, there are times when the things that are being raised, the subjects and topics, need to be discussed more fully. But it always has to be in the context of a marketplace of ideas and of free speech. Yeah.
But I think one of the concerns, which we have seen, especially in the last 2 years, is this idea. Wesley Yang called it the vertically integrated messaging apparatus. Zaid Jilani called it the blue stack. How big tech seems to work in collusion with, other NGOs, governments sometimes. Yeah. And even in the example of what happened to Parler when Donald Trump got kicked off Twitter, when Parler tried to become the Knicks social network and then gets kicked out of the apps. It's just platform upon platform upon platform. And how deep do you go? How deep does the censorship go? Payment processing companies and things like that. And they act almost in concert. Whether or not there's coordination, it doesn't seem to be the case at all, but they're just acting as if there was. Yeah. And to service a particular party or narrative. And, we saw that in the Hunter Biden case as well, when that story broke just before the election. And it just seems like even though I'm optimistic that competition, that the American economy is vibrant enough that there will be competition and people will flock certain places, it just seems sometimes when these things happen, it seems insurmountable, that there's just so much power concentrated in the stack that it seems hard to surmount.
I agree with you that all of these things are concerning. And, and as somebody who's read a lot of dystopian literature, I have to say that, the day that the New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop went up, and I went to Twitter and, because I'd heard like it was being censored somehow, and like the inability to link to it or to like acknowledge it on that platform, that was deeply disturbing. I mean, because that's what you would see in a movie where things are being shut down in a way. And then, it's creepy. To his credit, Jack Dorsey did not mumble an apology or kind of explain it away the way that Zuckerberg recently on Joe Rogan kind of talked about why Facebook, de-amplified that story and how that took place. Dorsey said that was an absolute mistake. And of course, he's no longer at Twitter. So, you might read into that. And he's a big proponent of, fully decentralized messaging platforms and things like that, which I like all of that. So there's absolutely no question that this is the case. And whether it is, a coordinated consensus or it's just that people are kind of allies, or are moving in the same direction, it is something that we need to fight back against, to always be expanding the scope of, free speech and free expression. By the same token, what also worries me is the move among conservatives, and populists and even some libertarians to say the only way we can fight this is by adopting the tactics of the left, of the woke left, and of government regulation. And, Ron DeSantis has tried this a couple of times to, create laws that would essentially tell businesses how to run their business in the name of protecting freedom and, limited government. That way, madness lies. And there is an alternative, which I think is a libertarian alternative, but it requires a lot of work, and it requires the type of work you're doing, the type of work people at Reason are doing and whatnot. And we need to ultimately, at the group level and at the platform level, we need to argue as loud as hell and, push for change within those levels. But ultimately, it is coming down to the individual level as well. And this is where we need to have the kind of education, but also the comfort with choice and difference and a protecting of that, even when we don't like the choices or the thoughts that other people are expressing. And, again, I just turned 59, which is unbelievable to me. But it's, like I grew up in a moment, so I was born in 1963. And there was a moment post World War II where particularly things like free speech and free expression broke open, only in the late 1950s. And this was a bunch of people who either went to jail or were threatened with jail, but to write and publish and perform in certain ways, whether it's Allen Ginsberg or Lawrence Ferlinghetti or, Lenny Bruce and whatnot. Like I realize now that I grew up in this weird moment where free speech was pretty valorized. And it was always struggling, but it was, everybody kind of agreed. And that I took that for like a kind of universal one-way breakthrough to an era now of like frictionless disagreement. Clearly that's wrong. And like what we are seeing now is like we need to fight to constantly not only be articulating, our individual points of view on given issues, but that larger embrace of a platform of free speech, because that is the best way forward on this stuff. And that is also what is fundamentally under attack, along with the individualism that it kind of springs from. So for me, that's like where that, in many ways, that's where the battle is.
I think one of the major issues of our time is that, the cultural and intellectual institutions around which American life is organized around themselves, like look at what's happening in the publishing industry or universities, it's under assault there. I actually wanted to ask you how all of this affects art and cultural output. Because I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but it seems that the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, like each decade was distinctive. It had its own style, its own, like Sirius XM can have that decade of music. And it seems to me that ever since like the year 2000 till now, it's been like just one long piece of just utter garbage. I mean, this sounds like, it sounds like I'm like
I hate to inform you, Melissa, but I think you're just getting old.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I sound like the old Muppets on the balconies, like, get off my lawn. But I'm wondering what you think about, because one thing you've actually educated me a lot on is just in general, just Americana, because I didn't grow up here and I don't really know many cultural touchstones, and you seem to be an expert in this area.
Which is a polite way of saying that I watch a lot of TV. So I think.
And just but the other kind of arts, like literature, poetry, and is it? I know wokeness affects comedy. We talk about that a lot, political correctness, but there also seems to be a flatness, because we live in this, we're trying to maximize shareholder value, data-driven world, and it just seems like we're not taking risks anymore. A song like Bohemian Rhapsody would not be produced by the studios anymore.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think about the state of art? And in your opinion, when was the golden age for all of this?
So the best decade for like American art will be the next one. Okay. As much as I like, certain things I grew up with. And I really, I really mean it, because like part of what you're talking about, Melissa, and this is not trivial, and I want to talk about it if we can, because I think it's really important, which is that communal experience where there is a couple of art objects that everybody from a moment in time can see, like we're all watching the same moon or something, and that connects us. And it may be that world is kind of disappearing. And there's a real loss there. I'm not sure it's happening, but let's get to that in a second. But what I would argue is that, when you look at what's out there, and this was, I started professionally really writing in the 90s in a serious way, just as the internet was becoming a mass phenomenon with the World Wide Web laid on top of it. And suddenly this profusion and proliferation of cultural expression which continues apace. And it is phenomenal, because like within a few clicks, both of legal and, non-authorized streaming services, or, using, BitTorrent and whatnot, like I can get at my fingertips virtually every movie, every song, every book that has ever been written, plus all of the stuff that has never been produced in those formats. The music studio or music labels, record labels have taken a hit. Movie studios are not what they were, even as they are producing more content annually than they used to. And it's hard to ever say, like, you can say, okay, this is a good decade, or this is a good time or a bad time for art. But like, when you say there's a flatness, there's stuff by like Lady Gaga that is as wonderfully bizarre and extreme and experimental as anything that Queen put forth. And then there are literally millions of bands on like Bandcamp or on SoundCloud, that are doing stuff that might only reach dozens of people, but it's all out there. Every experiment is happening in real time. Plus, you can rummage through the archives of the past. So for me, this is a spectacular period. And I can tell you, as somebody who both loves certain kinds of mass culture, but also was always like, this isn't speaking to me. Like the ability to find niche culture and mainstream culture is like unparalleled. And it's continued to grow exponentially since the internet. And even before then, this is part of the story of post-war America, which I'm very interested in. And, when you look at like in the 50s, the kind of the rise of underground publishing, and, and there's earlier cognates to this in a previous era, but it's just people, when copying machines became possible and printing became cheaper. And then, in the 70s, when like early versions of desktop publishing happened, like suddenly people were able to expand their audiences and cross-pollinate and mix. It's just, it's so phenomenal. And, Angel, I mean, I know you're a musician and whatnot, and, it's a double-edged sword. I used to be a music journalist back in the 80s. And, there were indie labels and stuff, but it was like, when you got signed by a major label, that was really important in a way that isn't important
and I think
anymore.
I think that's a good thing, right? So in the context of being a musician and trying to make it, trying to get out there, right? It used to be that the gatekeepers, you needed to get through them, right? And the gate was really small, and everything on the other side of the gate was extremely important, right? You weren't going to record, you weren't going to get an audience, you weren't going to tour. None of those things were going to happen unless you had support from these bigwigs who had the power to facilitate all that stuff for you. The internet has completely obliterated that, right? So on the one hand, it's great because I can just record in my bedroom an entire album, put it up on the internet immediately, and it can reach the people that it will reach, right? On the other hand, of course,
or it can be like publishing, where it's like, or it could be released, it could reach the dozens of people that are going to listen to it. Or it can be released by a major studio or a publishing house and reach dozens of people. Like,
so it's not necessarily going to help you if you get signed anymore.
I interviewed Andrew WK, who's a musician and performer, who kind of came in at like in the late 90s, and he got signed to a major record deal and whatnot. And so he got to see the end of the studio system as it kind of existed in post-war America. And then it kind of fell apart, and he had to reinvent himself in various ways. And it's, and it's very different, and it's not necessarily better. It's certainly not better for all people, but more people are participating in the production and consumption and circulation and distribution of music than ever
there are a couple
before.
of problems with this, though. It reminds me of this Christopher Hitchens quote where he says, it's true. It's true that everyone has a book in them. And for the vast majority of people, that's where it should stay. Right? So that's just another way of saying, now everybody's got a band. Everybody's got a Bandcamp. Everybody's got an album and a website.
Everybody has a podcast.
Everybody's got a podcast.
Everybody has a podcast. Okay.
I mean, I think all of us probably have more than one podcast. So it's like, it's already enough.
There's an overwhelming number now, and you just get lost in the mix. And so the rat race just kind of shifted to something else, because now people need to do the extra thing to get up, to get ahead, and to get above everybody else in order to get people's attention. So there's that problem. But there's also the problem of I've been thinking about this a lot. There will never be another Michael Jackson. There will never be another Beatles. Right. And it's not because there won't be somebody as talented. I don't think that's the case. I think there are plenty of people just as talented, I'm sure, out there. But we're not going to know about it necessarily, and we're not going to receive it in the same sort of way, right? The way that when the Thriller video debuted, everyone was glued to the screen and they couldn't wait to see it. It was just this mind-blowing event. And there was a commonality, like the way you were saying about, we all have the same moon. That thing doesn't exist anymore. And I think that is a loss of a kind.
I think it may be, and it's definitely a loss of a kind.
Yeah.
Does it matter that much? And let me tell you a story, which because you mentioned the Beatles, so I feel legitimated in telling this. I was in high school when John Lennon was shot in like December of 1980. And I had been out at a book club. I swear I wasn't doing anything bad. And I came home late, and my father was up, and my father had been born in the 1920s. And as I came in, he said, "Oh, one of those Beatles was shot." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, "One of the Beatles guys was shot." And I was like, "Well, which one?" And, this in 1980, my father was born in 1923. So somebody do the math. He was in his late 50s, right? So he's like my age. And can you imagine ever being in a world where you didn't know who the fucking Beatles were individually and what their personalities were and everything? And I was like, well, which one? Because it kind of matters. And then he said to me, not the one with the nose, the one with the wife. And I was like, oh, okay. So is John Lennon. And it was like, yeah. Yeah, in Central Park, or whatever, the Dakota. He was born not far from there. So I tell that story partly because it's like my father absolutely participated fully in the 20th century. He was, 20th century America. He was an immigrant critic who grew up in the Depression. He was in the Normandy invasion. And then he became middle class, of middle class. He's there, and he had no fucking idea who the Beatles were. He would not have been able to name a single song. And I say that not to take away from the Beatles or anything, but just to throw into question how big a loss is it that people don't know, that Michael Jackson had a chimp named Bubbles, right? And Michael Jackson, I can tell you when the last pop magazine that I worked for, it was an American version of a British magazine called Smash Hits. We used to be able to put Michael Jackson or Madonna or Duran Duran on the cover of, this was not a good magazine, and you could sell 100,000 or 200,000 copies on the newsstand. Like, these people were gods who moved product, and nobody exists like that anymore. Really, it's so things have definitely changed. But to me, whatever loss there is, and I agree, it's a change and there is a loss, because you want everybody to be able to depend, and it depends on your age, which matters, but at closing time to be able to, everybody to know the words of a Van Morrison song or of, American Pie or whatever, maybe Thriller, Billie Jean or something. I don't know, and to have that shared experience. And we may not have that in the same way as we used to. But the gain from setting everybody free from those systems of narrow control and cultural production and consumption and individual idea, because to me, ultimately, what I find fascinating about people like Madonna and Michael Jackson in particular is that they, people have said this about the Velvet Underground or the Ramones, their albums didn't sell it very well, but everybody who saw them in concert was like, I'm going to start a band and do my own. So they're like change agents. Like Madonna in particular, I think just, she makes everything possible because you're like, well, if she can do it, I can do it. And I'm going to do my version of that and live an individual life like I want to actualize. And I think we're still in that. And so that's the dynamic that's fundamentally important, not whether or not we all know what's number one on the Billboard charts. Having said that, if I may bring this back to a larger question, and Melissa, I really take this seriously, and I don't know the answer to this, and I don't want to be glib about it, but it is on kind of the national level, or in a community, in a broader community, whether we consider, call ourselves Americans or we call ourselves cosmopolitans or something, what in an age where we can kind of go in and out of different communities at will, and we don't have an overwhelming, forced identity.
Aesthetic.
Yeah. How do we stay close enough to one another so that we agree to disagree, as opposed to just being like, you know what, fuck you, I'm done with you and your system. Because I think that's part of the dynamic that's going on now, where it's people can't agree to disagree because we don't feel like we're part of the same collective identity.
That's kind of what I was getting at. It's like, listen, I hate everything you're thinking and everything you're saying and everything you stand for, but man, Billie Jean slaps. We're both grooving to that. When it comes on, we're bobbing our heads. And it just, that's a fundamental thing that we can't do anything about. It's a reality.
And we have those moments of, after 9/11, and it really lasted, maybe a couple of weeks if we're even stretching it, but that we're all Americans, right? Even the French were Americans briefly. Is there a way to forge a collective identity that helps structure positive interactions, that creates an operating system that allows us to respect certain very broad rules and that keep us as a functioning community or a collective or a society. And I think that's part of what we need to, in this new age of individualism, of lived individual experience and of choice of, I get more than in the past, I get to choose how I define myself. Society is going to define me, but I have more relative power than I used to. And I get to choose where I live, because in fact, in general, I mean, there's definitely attempts to shut down borders in the United States and in Europe and in many parts of the world. But broadly speaking, more people are moving around the globe, like with a freedom that is kind of historically rare. But then that presents, what then is an American, right? In a world where we're at the level of foreign-born percentage of the population that we were in the mid-20s, which caused a freak out to shut down immigration. Like how do we come up with these identities that allow us to, kind of participate fully in everything that modern society has to offer?
Well, I recall in the book Identity by Francis Fukuyama, he actually talks about how identity politics is a response to this kind of feeling unmoored in a way that modern culture kind of, paradoxically frees us, but causes this crisis, this existential crisis in a way that makes people search for identities in ways that he thinks contributes to this rise of kind of identity politics. And, downstream, we're all now living in the culture that, that's consequential to that.
Right.
What do you agree with his assessment?
To a certain degree. And I interviewed him when that book came out, and I think was it 2017 or 2018? It might even
16, I think.
16, yeah.
Oh, it was after Trump, actually.
Yeah, and it was, but it was very prescient.
And
there were a couple of other books that were like that were talking about, there was, the kind of breakdown of a broadly collective American identity that allowed us to recognize each other as, of the same broad tribe in a way that was kind of working. It's never perfect or anything. And in that, if I'm remembering, and in our conversation and in the book, he kind of talks about, okay, well, we got to return to the idea of the United States as a creedal nation, that we are not, unlike most countries, it's not about blood and soil. It's not about, that you've lived here for many generations or that you all look alike. And, on some level, there's power to that, but it's also God like that, so like the solution to, calls for reparations is to read the Declaration of Independence and recite the Pledge of Allegiance or something. And it's not enough, and this is also something that kind of libertarians get attacked on, like, that we're abstractions. We're not living in the thick real life of like what it means to be a community, and like go to, deindustrialized Ohio where everybody is, fucked up from opioids because all the factory jobs left, et cetera, and I've lived in, precisely that kind of place. I've lived in the deindustrialized Midwest, and not as a tourist, but, as somebody. I lived in Southwestern Ohio, full and part-time for like 20 years. So I get that. And it may not be as extreme as many people on the coast say it is, because everybody has a reason to paint the picture as particularly dire. But I do think we need to, come up with a good, functional, broad definition of what it means to be an American in 21st century, the 21st century world, because we've gone through phases, and there was, where, well, we were all immigrants, whether we were brought here by force or by choice, by economic force or by slavery or something like that. That doesn't have the juice that it had, that we're all the opposite of communists, that we're all like Yankee traitors or something like that. We need to really work on that and come up with something. And for me, I think, this is the paradoxical kind of group identity, which I have not articulated with any clarity to my own liking, much less to having any impact on the world, is that there's this weird irony in like emphasizing individualism, that America is kind of like, is a place where you go to be the best individual that you can be. And, so like, it's a nation or a community of individuals. And, what proceeds from that are a series of kind of political institutions, social conventions, economic, regulations and things like that. But I don't know that has the
Well, maybe
juice, because it's not as good as being in a gang, and beating other people
well,
up.
maybe.
Which is one way that you form group identity. I mean, the PBS is running a very good documentary by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein shortly called "The U.S. and the Holocaust," and it's about the U.S. in the 30s and like how did people in America respond to increasing reports of increasing violence against European Jews, and the Nazis had the one thing you can say about them is that they had a very good method for creating in-groups and out-groups, and structuring society. Imperial Japan did this. Melissa, I mean, you may be in a position because you come from such a young country, which is still creating its foundational myth and identity. Obviously, you rejected that on a profound level that you're living in the United States, but like seeing the machinery of how does a kind of cultural identity get constructed out of almost nothing. That's what we need to be working on, and it needs to be in a way that is not, in the past, what it meant to be an American. And this is part of my dissertation was about like in the 1920s, in the face of all these immigrants, who didn't speak English, who ate garlic and who worshiped strange gods flooding into cities that were for the first time dominating the American landscape. There were a lot of books written by people who had been here for a long time, about, okay, well, this is what an American is. This is how an American acts. And weirdly, it never, it like there was no role for like a garlic eating Italian who went to church every day, who went to Roman Catholic Mass every day. Like, yeah, you're not American. And, that goes way back. What's his name? Henry Thoreau in Walden. At one point, he, on a side, he dives into a lean-to during a rainstorm in Walden Woods, and there's an Irish migrant family there. And he goes off on a little riff about how they can never be the real Americans. He's the real American. So, like we've always been doing, like we got to come up with better definitions that also are not so vague and blah that they don't mean
it. Well, maybe our final question will give you an opportunity to try out the ultimate in-group, which is just humanity itself, just the fact that we're all human beings. The last question we ask all our guests is, as you know, our approach at FAIR is to take what we call a pro-human approach to the issues that we've been discussing and all the issues that we grapple with. So, why don't you go ahead and think out loud about what pro-human means to you? How do you conceptualize that idea? And how other people can take that concept and run with it in maybe the ways that you were just talking about?
I mean, I do like, and I'm so committed to it that I've forgotten the Roman author who, stated it, but the epigram that nothing that is human is foreign to me. It's, I find that like a truly profound statement. And I think cultivating an appreciation for that. I was, there's a book by the American novelist Bernard Malamud called The Fixer, which is about a guy in like turn of the century Ukraine. I think it's Eastern Europe, who gets caught up in a pogrom and he's accused of killing Christian babies to make matzah. It's like the blood libel. And what's profound about it is, it's an American Jew imagining this in terms of universal humanity, of like, you get into the mindset of what it feels like to be othered that much, because a lot of it is from the perspective of the guy who is going to be killed because of this. But it also paints how societies take people who were part of a society and then other them so profoundly. And, being aware of that. And then also being aware, and this is what I love about kind of libertarian ideas and, and about markets and about the concept of gains from trade, like the idea that if absent force, we tend to, humans are very social and we exchange a lot, sometimes economically, sometimes culturally, sometimes, physically and all of this kind of stuff. But it's like we tend to do it because like we will be better off. Like if you have something that you don't value as much as I kind of value it, and I have something I don't value, at the end of an exchange, if I give you $1 for a glass of milk, you're better off because you didn't want the milk, and I'm better off because, I didn't want the dollar as much. And I think kind of mapping that onto an understanding also of the glories of kind of mongrelization and hybridization that are everywhere in nature and in culture and in history. I think a lot about, for me, I think the study of history is fundamentally about a pro-human approach. My grandparents and my families from Ireland and Italy were for 1,000 years. And I only know my family history back to my grandparents. I don't know anything beyond that. But, for 1,000 years or whatever, they were just bred to be peasants. They were non-player characters in history. And they, they came to America, and then suddenly, like, what am I? Like, I'm neither Irish nor Italian. I am American, but I'm a different American than my parents or grandparents were. My kids are radically different. They have a different, kind of heritage, genetic and ethnic, as well as financial and economic. And the idea of, that endless mixing and churn, which can be very overwhelming and it can be exhausting, but it's also, it's reality, and it's really exciting because we're constantly in a kind of social and cultural and political active alchemy where we're just taking base materials and kind of creating something more valuable out of them. And to me, thinking about that and thinking about humans, I mean, like, this is kind of fucking great, right? That the three of us are on this podcast. We are all super of the moment. We're all super Americans, and Melissa, I have to give you, like, you get the gold medal because you chose to be here. I mean, I guess Angel and I chose not to leave, so that's okay, but we're kind of lazy. In fact, if I'm recalling correctly, we're both living within a couple dozen miles of where we were born. I somehow I was born in Brooklyn. I live in Lower Manhattan. I traveled around the country, and I ended up not far from home. Angel, you're from New Jersey, right? And you're in New Jersey or in New York. Yep. But what I'm getting at is, the idea that, that mongrelization and the hybridization and that process and discovery, it's kind of beautiful and wonderful. And what are the attitudes? What are the mindsets? What are the institutions that allow that to happen? Not without problems, because there are, but as frictionless as possible and as powerful as possible. And there will be times where we want to limit it, but it's like, no, that's the way to riches, both, material and immaterial. So for me, and in an American context, it is very much grounded in the idea of history and of migration, both within the country and from without the country, and then constantly looking at what is that which is human is not foreign to me. I think, that inspires me on a daily basis. And I don't know, and this is a real loss or a real lack. I don't know how to, manifest that, in, like, here's a 5-point program for education or something. But, that for me is the beginning, the idea of understanding that human society is about alchemy ultimately. And it's about mongrelizing and changing and growing and moving into a future that includes more people rather than fewer.
That's beautiful. That might be my favorite answer to the pro-human question of all. Awesome. Thank you very much, Nick Gillespie, for joining us.
I was going to say I'm also very pro-dog.
Pro-human, pro-dog.
Yes. See, now this conversation is over because I'm pro-cat. There we go. So, and we obviously we cannot live in a society with dogs and cats.
Blocked and reported.
Right. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us on Fairperspectives. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the stuff you guys are doing and for the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you for listening to Fairperspectives. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating and review. You can also access exclusive podcast content such as Q&As and bonus episodes by visiting us and signing up at fairperspectives.org. For weekly fair news and opinion pieces by members of the fair community, visit our Substack at fairforall.substack.com and tune into Fair News Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to join or support the pro-human movement, visit us at fairforall.org/join us. Thanks again, and see you next time.